Now, as far as we know, there is no drawback to consuming caffeine on a daily basis, again, provided it does not disrupt your nighttime sleep and provided that it does not induce anxiety. In fact, most of the world consumes caffeine every single day. The current estimates are that 90%, that's right, 90% of adults throughout the world consume a caffeinated beverage every single day. That's a staggeringly high number, making caffeine the most popular drug on the planet. In fact, because of the way that caffeine works, and just to remind you how it works, it effectively blocks adenosine receptors. Adenosine is a molecule that builds up in your brain and body more and more according to how long you've been awake. It makes you feel sleepy. Caffeine blocks the adenosine receptor, and then when it is dislodged from that receptor, whatever adenosine has built up and is around can then bind to the adenosine receptor and makes you feel very sleepy. That's the caffeine crash. So if 90% of the adult population of the planet Earth is consuming caffeine every day, that means 90% of the adult population of planet Earth is blocking their adenosine receptors for some portion of their daily life, and then their adenosine is binding to the vacant receptor once the caffeine has dislodged. And why are 90% of adult humans consuming caffeine every day? Well, to feel more energized, more focused, to have more both cognitive energy and physical energy. Now, of course, most people are not walking around thinking, oh, caffeine gives me more energy, more focus, etc. Most people are consuming caffeine every single day and are consuming caffeine every single day in order to feel, quote unquote, normal, to be at their baseline level of cognitive ability and physical energy and so on. In fact, if you look at the data on caffeine consumption, what you'll find is that caffeine actually is a cognitive enhancer. It can improve learning and memory. It can increase physical energy. It can increase mental and physical stamina. But a feature of those studies that's not often discussed, but that was, however, discussed in the full episode on caffeine, is that studies of caffeine typically are done by taking chronic caffeine users and then having them abstain from caffeine for some period of time, usually 4 days to 2 weeks, in which time they undergo caffeine withdrawal. They do not feel well. They get foggy headed. They have less energy. There's some malaise, sometimes even some mild depression. And then what they do is they have people take caffeine and take a cognitive exam or do some physical activity and compare their performance to what it was when they were in the withdrawal state. Another typical form of study on caffeine is to take people who are naive to caffeine or who never take caffeine and then have them ingest caffeine and then measure their cognitive and or physical performance. And in both cases, you see improvements. What I'm saying here is that daily caffeine consumption is not going to lead to improvements in cognitive ability or improvements in physical ability above one's baseline unless you either abstain from caffeine for some period of time, typically 4 days to 2 weeks prior, or you are not somebody who typically ingests caffeine. In other words, 90% of the world's population is drinking caffeine on a daily basis to be at their normal level of mental and physical functioning. So the question was, is there a net benefit to daily caffeine consumption? And here I can reliably say, provided you don't suffer from anxiety attacks or lack of sleep from the caffeine consumption, provided that you're mindful of not ingesting caffeine too late in the day, there doesn't seem to be any big drawback to drinking caffeine on a daily basis. However, there doesn't seem to be any great benefit, at least in terms of direct effects on cognitive or physical ability. Okay, so I realize this is a little bit of a convoluted answer, but we have to be honest with one another here. Caffeine is a performance-enhancing drug, but only when compared to the non-caffeinated state, and 90% of the adult population of the world is caffeinated. So adding more caffeine above what you would normally consume is certainly not going to allow you to think better and perform better physically. Here's a useful way to think about caffeine. Most people can pretty well tolerate doses of caffeine anywhere from 100 milligrams to 300 milligrams. Depends on body weight and depends on your tolerance. Tolerance, of course, based on how familiar you are with the effects of caffeine and how regularly you consume it. A typical cup of coffee, which by the way does not exist, depending on the vendor, depending on how much water to coffee ratio one uses, depending on whether or not it's French press or it's pour over. the type of coffee, et cetera, all of that is going to determine the total amount of caffeine in that coffee. But we can set some outer bounds on the total amount of caffeine that likely exists in a cup of coffee. And it's probably somewhere between 100 milligrams, that would be on the weaker side for a 6 or 8 ounce cup of coffee, out to about 300 milligrams for the equivalent 6 to 8 ounces of coffee. But if you were to brew your coffee very, very strong, or like me, occasionally throw a shot of espresso in there too, you could get that number up to 400 or 500 milligrams of caffeine. I personally tolerate caffeine pretty well. I've been drinking caffeine since I was a teenager, mostly in the form of brewed, unflavored yerba mate tea. It's important to stay away from the smoked varieties of yerba mate. If you're going to get your caffeine from yerba mate, the smoked varieties can be carcinogenic. The non-smoked varieties don't seem to have that property. But there's a lot of caffeine in yerba mate, so I'll drink yerba mate and have for many, many years. Or I'll drink black coffee or espresso Americano, things of that sort. That's my preferred source of caffeine. Most people are drinking coffee to get their caffeine. And I would say that if you are going to drink your caffeine, drink it in the early part of the day. As I mentioned earlier, I am a big proponent of delaying your first caffeine intake until at least 90 minutes after waking in order to avoid the afternoon crash. I've talked a lot about this on the podcast. There are a lot of clips on the internet explaining the rationale behind that. And if you do experience an afternoon crash in energy, I do recommend delaying your morning caffeine intake to 90 to 120 minutes after waking. Now, for people that want to get more of a true cognitive enhancing and performance enhancing effect from caffeine, again, you're going to have to abstain from caffeine for about 4 days. For regular caffeine drinkers, that's going to be difficult, right? That is going to lead to headaches. That's going to lead to brain fog. That's going to lead to feelings of malaise. In fact, the last time I took 4 days off or even a week off from caffeine consumption was when I was sick. I don't get sick very often, but when I am sick, I generally abstain from caffeine. And sometimes I wonder whether or not the malaise I feel from whatever viral or bacterial thing I might be dealing with when I'm sick is in part the malaise of caffeine withdrawal. I certainly notice I feel much better when I return to drinking caffeine, but that tends to coincide with feeling relief from whatever sinus symptoms and other symptoms I might have been experiencing from the illness. So it's not a good experiment. I can't tease apart those variables. So the short answer is, for most adults, there does not seem to be any major downside to consuming caffeine. And there have been scattered reports here and there in humans showing that ingesting caffeine can increase dopamine receptors, which will effectively allow you to get more out of the dopamine that you produce. This is why caffeine has a mood elevating as well as energy elevating effect.